August 25, 1942, and a Japanese naval officer stands on the deck of his transport ship, watching the dark coastline of Papua New Guinea emerge through the tropical rain, absolutely certain this will be over in 72 hours because the enemy waiting on that beach is Australian. And everyone knows Australians are just weekend soldiers playing dress-up for the British Empire, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. And I mean that literally. Because what happened at Milne Bay over the next 2 weeks didn't just change the Pacific War, it shattered something the Japanese military thought was unbreakable, their reputation for invincibility on land. You've heard about Midway 1,000 times, watched the documentaries, seen the movies, nodded along as historians called it the turning point of the Pacific. But here's what they don't tell you often enough. Midway was a naval battle, ships and planes fighting over empty ocean, and when it ended, the Japanese Navy limped home still believing their ground forces were unstoppable because they had never lost a major land battle in this war, not once, not ever, until a swampy, mosquito-infested hellhole called Milne Bay proved them catastrophically wrong. Stay with me because this story reveals why Japan's defeat wasn't written in the skies over Midway, but in the mud of an Australian defensive position most people can't even find on a map. Milne Bay in 1942 is exactly the kind of place you'd expect to be strategically worthless. A narrow stretch of coastline on the eastern tip of New Guinea, surrounded by jungle so thick you can't see 10 feet in any direction, swamps that swallow men whole, mountains that rise like walls, rain that never stops, and diseases that kill you slower and more painfully than bullets. Yet the Allies are building an airfield there, because someone in strategic planning realized this miserable place sits perfectly positioned to threaten Japanese positions at Rabaul and protect the sea lanes to Australia, which means the Japanese absolutely cannot let it stay in Allied hands. The Japanese plan is textbook imperial confidence. Land a few thousand troops, overwhelm the small garrison they assume is there, secure the airfield, and move on to the next objective before anyone realizes what happened, because in their experience, overwhelming force plus surprise plus the psychological terror of facing Japanese infantry equals automatic victory. And why would Milne Bay be any different? Here's why. Because the Australians waiting there aren't a small garrison. They're 2 full militia brigades plus veteran units. They've been digging in for weeks. They know the terrain intimately. And most importantly, they've got something the Japanese planners never factored into their calculations: a burning determination to prove that Australian soldiers are not second-rate troops playing support roles for real armies, but warriors who can stand and fight and win against the best the Empire of Japan can throw at them. The Japanese landing begins on August 25th, under cover of darkness, and immediately nothing goes according to plan, because the weather is worse than expected. The landing zones are narrower than intelligence suggested, and those Australian troops, who were supposed to panic and run, are instead dug in and firing with disciplined accuracy that suggests someone drastically underestimated who they were fighting. The Japanese commander, Hayashi Yutaka, is a competent officer who's won battles before, but he's operating under assumptions that are about to cost him everything. He believes he's facing maybe 1,000 poorly trained militia. He believes the Australians will fold under pressure like colonial troops always do. And he believes his tanks will dominate the battlefield, because tanks always dominate when you're fighting people who don't have proper anti-tank weapons. Except the Australians do have anti-tank weapons, and they have a lot more than 1,000 men, and they're not folding under anything. Think about the psychological shock of this moment for the Japanese troops. Every battle they've fought since Pearl Harbor has followed the same script. Land, advance, watch the enemy retreat or surrender, secure the objective, move on. But at Milne Bay, the script is getting rewritten in real time, and nobody told them there was going to be improvisation. August 26th, and the Japanese are pushing along a single narrow coastal track, with jungle pressing in from one side and ocean from the other, which means there's no room for tactical flexibility, no space to flank or maneuver, just straight-ahead frontal assault against prepared positions. And their tanks that were supposed to terrify the Australians are instead becoming steel coffins because the track is muddy and the tanks keep bogging down, and the Australian anti-tank gunners are picking them off methodically. Here's where you need to understand something about the Australian mindset in 1942. They've watched Singapore fall. They've watched the supposedly impregnable fortress of British colonial power surrender to a smaller Japanese force. They've heard about Malaya and Burma and the Philippines. They've absorbed the narrative that Japanese troops are somehow superhuman jungle fighters who cannot be defeated in close combat. And they've decided that narrative is propaganda garbage that needs to be disproven with bullets. The Australian 61st Battalion and the 210th Battalion are militia units, meaning they're not career soldiers, they're citizens who signed up to defend their country. And they're fighting with the particular fury of men who know that if they lose here, the Japanese invasion fleet could reach Australian soil within weeks. Which means this isn't just a battle for some random beach in New Guinea. This is a battle for whether their families back home wake up to news of victory or invasion. Night fighting at Milne Bay becomes something out of a fever dream, because the jungle is so dark, you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. The rain never stops. Every sound could be an infiltrator or a falling branch, and both sides are firing at shadows and muzzle flashes and ghost movements that might be real or might be terror-induced hallucinations. The Japanese excel at night combat. It's one of their tactical signatures. They train for it specifically because they know Western troops fear fighting in darkness, but the Australians at Milne Bay don't get the memo about being afraid. They set up ambushes. They use the rain and darkness to their advantage. They fight the kind of vicious close-quarters battle that turns every tree into cover and every muddy foxhole into a fortress. Remember how confident that Japanese naval officer was about 72 hours? It's been 48 hours, and his troops are still stuck on the same coastal track they landed on, taking casualties from an enemy that was supposed to evaporate, running low on ammunition because the supply situation is turning catastrophic, and starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, they walked into something they weren't prepared for. August 29th, and the Japanese make their big push, throwing everything they have left at the Australian positions because they need to break through now or admit this operation is failing. And failure is not a concept the Imperial Japanese Army is comfortable with, so they attack with the kind of desperate courage that borders on suicidal charging machine gun positions, trying to overwhelm through sheer aggression what they cannot defeat through tactical superiority. The Australians hold. They hold because they have to, because there's nowhere to retreat to, because this is the moment that defines whether they're taken seriously as soldiers or dismissed as colonial militia playing war. And when the Japanese assault finally breaks against their positions, it's not a clean tactical withdrawal, it's a collapse, a psychological shattering, the first time in this war that Japanese ground forces have attacked in strength and been decisively repulsed by Western troops. Think about what this means for the Japanese strategic position. They've built their entire expansion on the assumption of inevitable victory in ground combat, on the psychological impact of their reputation for never losing, and now a bunch of Australian militia has just proved that reputation is breakable, which means if it can break here, it can break anywhere. The evacuation begins on September 5th, and it's an admission of defeat that reverberates through the entire Japanese command structure because the Imperial Japanese Army doesn't evacuate, they die in place or they conquer, but they don't retreat from inferior forces, except they are retreating. They are loading survivors onto ships under cover of darkness and abandoning their equipment and leaving their dead and sailing away from a battle they started with absolute confidence and finished with absolute failure. The Australians don't let them leave easily. They harass the withdrawal, they kill stragglers. They make sure the Japanese understand this isn't a tactical repositioning, it's a rout, a defeat, a historical first that will echo through every subsequent battle in the Pacific. MacArthur immediately recognizes what this means and issues a statement that reads in part, "The myth of Japanese invincibility has been destroyed," which is great PR, except it's not actually a myth that's been destroyed. It's Japanese strategic assumptions, the belief that intimidation plus aggression equals automatic victory, the certainty that Western troops will break under pressure, the confidence that the empire's expansion is unstoppable. Here's what makes Milne Bay historically crucial compared to Midway. Naval battles are about sinking ships and losing aircraft. They're strategically important, but psychologically distant. You lose at sea, and you can tell yourself it was bad luck or superior enemy numbers or weather conditions. but losing a ground battle to troops you considered inferior attacks. Something deeper. It questions whether your training is adequate, whether your tactics work, whether your entire military philosophy is built on assumptions that don't survive contact with determined enemies. The Japanese Navy after Midway still believed they could win the war, just with different tactics, but the Japanese army after Milne Bay started to quietly acknowledge that maybe their ground forces weren't invincible. Maybe the Australians and Americans weren't going to collapse under pressure. Maybe this war was going to be longer and harder and bloodier than anyone in Tokyo wanted to admit. If you think that sounds like overthinking one relatively small battle, consider this. After Milne Bay, the Japanese never again attempted a major amphibious assault without massive superiority in numbers. They never again assumed Australian troops would be easy targets, and they fundamentally changed their strategic posture in the Pacific from offensive expansion to defensive consolidation, which is exactly what you do when you realize you can't win the war you thought you were fighting. The Australian casualties are significant, over 300 dead and wounded, which for a small nation with a small army represents a painful sacrifice. But the Japanese losses are worse. Nearly 700 killed plus hundreds more wounded or dead from disease, and more importantly, they lose something you can't measure in casualty statistics. They lose the psychological edge that comes from being considered unbeatable. The Australian survivors don't get parades or movies or decades of historical attention. Milne Bay becomes a footnote in most Pacific War histories, overshadowed by Guadalcanal and later battles. But the men who fought there know what they accomplished. They proved that Japanese infantry could be beaten by properly trained and motivated troops fighting on terrain they understood, which is a lesson that ripples through every subsequent battle in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and eventually the Philippines. You want to understand why the island-hopping campaign worked? It's because commanders knew after Milne Bay that Japanese troops would fight to the death, but they weren't supernatural warriors who couldn't be defeated. They were human beings who could be outfought and outmaneuvered and outlasted by enemies who refused to accept the narrative of inevitable Japanese victory. The strategic implications unfold over months because the Japanese High Command doesn't immediately announce to the world that they lost at Milne Bay. They downplay it, classify the reports, tell themselves it was an anomaly, a special case, bad terrain, unexpected enemy strength. But privately they're recalculating their entire position in the Southwest Pacific. Port Moresby, the major target that Milne Bay was supposed to support capturing, becomes unreachable because now the Allies have a secure base at Milne Bay from which to launch air attacks against any Japanese advance, which means the overland attack through the Owen Stanley Mountains becomes the only option, which leads to the Kokoda Track campaign, which becomes another grinding defeat for Japanese forces trying to fight Australians in jungle terrain. You see the pattern? Milne Bay doesn't just stop one landing. It derails the entire Japanese strategy for isolating Australia and securing the resource-rich islands of the Southwest Pacific. It forces a strategic defensive posture that Japan never recovers from. And it happens because a bunch of militia troops and veteran infantry units decided they were going to hold a muddy airfield against an enemy that thought they were already beaten. Let's talk about the airfield itself, because this is what the battle was really about. The Australians and Americans had built 2 airstrips at Milne Bay that could base fighters and bombers to threaten Japanese positions at Rabaul, which was the major Japanese base in the region and the launching point for their entire Southwest Pacific campaign. The Japanese needed to capture or destroy those airfields to maintain their air superiority. Without those bases, they couldn't protect their supply lines or support their ground operations or prevent Allied aircraft from attacking their shipping. So when they failed to take Milne Bay, they didn't just lose a battle. They lost the air war in the region, which meant they eventually lost the ground war, which meant they eventually lost everything. Strategic military planning is like chess, except you're playing with human lives and imperfect information. And if you make a wrong assumption about what your opponent is capable of, you don't just lose pieces, you lose entire campaigns. The Japanese planners assumed the Australians at Milne Bay were a minor obstacle, made the same mistake Napoleon made in Russia and Hitler made in the Soviet Union. They underestimated the enemy's will to fight and overestimated their own ability to win through intimidation and aggression, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late to salvage the operation. September 1942. And while the world is watching Stalingrad and North Africa and the Battle of the Atlantic, while headlines are screaming about German advances and Soviet resistance and British defensive victories, the Pacific War is quietly transforming because of a 2-week battle in a place most people have never heard of. The Japanese war machine that seemed unstoppable 8 months earlier is now fighting defensive battles, trying to hold what they have rather than capture more, reacting to Allied moves instead of dictating the pace of the war, and Milne Bay is where that transformation begins. Not in some dramatic single moment, but in the slow realization among Japanese commanders that they're not fighting inferior troops who will collapse under pressure. They're fighting enemies who are learning, adapting, getting better with every battle, and who have industrial capacity and reinforcement pipelines that Japan simply cannot match in a prolonged war. The mathematics of attrition start working against Japan after Milne Bay because every soldier they lose is irreplaceable. Every tank destroyed can't be quickly rebuilt. Every ship sunk reduces their already strained logistics, while the Allies are just getting started, ramping up production, training more troops, developing better tactics, and most importantly, learning that Japanese forces can be beaten if you fight smart and refuse to be intimidated. The Australian veterans of Milne Bay spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to people why this battle mattered, why it wasn't just another fight in a long war, why the moment they held those defensive positions and stopped the Japanese advance was the moment the Pacific War's momentum shifted irreversibly. Some historians listen, others dismiss it as Australian national pride exaggerating a minor engagement, but the veterans know what they saw. They saw Japanese confidence turn to uncertainty. They saw the Empire's supposedly invincible infantry retreat in disorder. They saw the psychological spell of Japanese invincibility break in real time. Historical turning points don't always announce themselves with dramatic fanfare. Sometimes they happen in mud and rain on a beach nobody cares about, fought by troops who don't get the glory, deciding outcomes that won't be obvious for years. Midway gets the movies and the attention because naval battles have drama, because aircraft carriers and dive bombers make for exciting visuals, because Americans love stories about their navy saving the day. But Milne Bay is where Japan's ground war strategy died, where the assumption of easy conquest met the reality of determined defense, where Australian soldiers proved they belonged in any conversation about elite combat troops. Think about the Japanese perspective after Milne Bay. You're a military planner in Tokyo. You've just received reports that your forces retreated from an objective they were supposed to secure in days. You're reading casualty lists that don't make sense because Australian militia isn't supposed to inflict these kinds of losses on imperial forces. And you're starting to realize that every assumption you made about this war might be wrong. Do you admit this publicly? Absolutely not. You classify the reports, you blame local commanders, you tell yourself it was bad luck. But privately, you're recalculating everything because if Australians can stop you at Milne Bay, then what happens when you face American Marines at Guadalcanal? What happens when you try to hold islands against enemies who refuse to believe you're invincible? The psychological advantage Japan gained at Pearl Harbor and maintained through 6 months of victories evaporates at Milne Bay. Not because of the scale of the defeat, but because of what it represents, the first crack in armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. The terrain at Milne Bay deserves its own analysis, because this isn't open battlefield where tactics and numbers determine everything. This is jungle warfare, where visibility is measured in yards, where disease kills as many as combat, where supply lines break down because roads don't exist and everything has to be carried through mud and swamps. The Japanese are good at jungle fighting. They've trained for it. They've succeeded in Malaya and Burma using tactics specifically designed for dense vegetation and limited visibility. But at Milne Bay, they're fighting on terrain the Australians have studied and prepared and turned into a defensive nightmare. Every choke point is covered by machine guns, every approach is mined or blocked, every clearing is a kill zone, and the single coastal track that's supposed to be the invasion route becomes a death trap where Japanese tanks bog down and infantry has nowhere to maneuver. Geography matters in warfare, it always has. Ask Napoleon about Russian winters or the Germans about Stalingrad's urban maze. And at Milne Bay, geography favors the defenders absolutely, which means Japanese tactical skill doesn't overcome the fundamental problem of attacking prepared positions with no room to use your superior numbers or mobility. Let's address something that often gets lost in military histories: the ordinary human experience of combat at Milne Bay, because statistics about casualties and strategic implications don't capture what it's like to spend 2 weeks fighting in tropical rain, sleeping in foxholes that fill with water, eating cold rations when you can eat at all, watching friends die from bullets or disease or sheer exhaustion, knowing that if you break and run, the entire defensive line collapses and the Japanese win. The Australian troops aren't superheroes. They're scared and tired and sick. They want to go home. They question whether they can hold for another day, another hour, but they hold anyway because that's what soldiers do when retreat isn't an option, and surrendering means death or worse. The Japanese troops are equally human. They're following orders from commanders who told them this would be easy. They're discovering that reality doesn't match the briefing. They're dying in mud far from home for an objective that makes less sense every day they fail to capture it. And when the evacuation finally comes, it's probably relief mixed with shame because the Imperial Japanese Army doesn't retreat, and they just did. September 7th, 1942. And Milne Bay is secured, the Japanese are gone. The Allies hold the airfield, and MacArthur is already writing press releases about turning the tide of the Pacific War, which is typical MacArthur, taking credit for other people's victories. But in this case, he's actually right about the significance, even if he's exaggerating his personal role. The Australian and American commanders on the ground know what they've accomplished. They've stopped the first Japanese amphibious assault of the war. They've proved that proper defensive preparation plus motivated troops equals Japanese defeat. They've opened the door to offensive operations because now the Japanese are reacting instead of acting. But they also know the war is far from over. This is one victory in what will be years of fighting, and celebrating too much feels premature when there are Japanese forces still in New Guinea, still threatening Australian territory, still killing Allied soldiers. Victory in war is weird like that. You win a battle, and you're relieved and proud and exhausted, but you can't rest because tomorrow brings new threats and new battles, and the possibility that this victory was just a lucky break before the next defeat. The historical debate about Milne Bay versus Midway as the real turning point of the Pacific War will never end because historians love arguing about counterfactuals and turning points and which battle really mattered most. But here's a way to think about it. Midway stopped Japanese naval expansion, Milne Bay stopped Japanese ground expansion, and you need both to actually win the war. The Navy can control the seas, but they can't occupy islands. The Army can take ground, but they can't do it without naval support and supply lines. So arguing about which battle was more important is like arguing about whether your heart or lungs are more essential. They're both critical, they work together, and losing either one means you die. What makes Milne Bay historically neglected compared to Midway is partly timing. It happened a few weeks later when the world was focused on Guadalcanal, partly national pride. Americans love celebrating American victories more than Allied victories, and partly the nature of the battle itself. Jungle fighting in rain and mud doesn't have the visual drama of carrier battles and aerial dogfights. It's harder to film, harder to romanticize, harder to turn into entertainment. So it gets remembered by military historians and forgotten by popular culture. The legacy of Milne Bay extends beyond 1942 because the Australians who fought there become the core of forces that fight through the rest of the New Guinea campaign, retaking Papua, pushing toward the Philippines, earning a reputation as some of the most effective jungle fighters in the Pacific. And every time they win another battle, they're building on the foundation of confidence established at Milne Bay. You can't quantify this in strategic analysis, the psychological impact of knowing you've beaten the best the enemy has, and you can do it again, but it matters enormously for combat effectiveness, because soldiers who believe they can win fight differently than soldiers who expect to lose. They take more risks, they recover from setbacks faster, they don't break under pressure because they've already proved to themselves they can withstand whatever the enemy throws at them. The Japanese experience the opposite. Every battle after Milne Bay carries the memory of that first defeat. The knowledge that Australian troops won't run, won't surrender easily, will make you pay for every yard of ground. And that knowledge makes commanders cautious, makes soldiers hesitant, creates a defensive mindset that's poison for an army that needs to stay aggressive to have any chance of winning. If you're wondering why this story isn't taught in every history class, why Milne Bay isn't a household name like D-Day, or Pearl Harbor, or Midway, part of it is simply historical distance. World War II produced thousands of battles, and most people only remember the biggest or most dramatic or most relevant to their national narratives. But part of it is also the uncomfortable truth that Australia's role in the Pacific War gets minimized in American-dominated historical narratives, where the United States is portrayed as the primary force defeating Japan, with occasional help from allies. The reality is more complex. Australian forces fought in every major campaign in the Southwest Pacific. They took casualties proportionally higher than American forces in many battles. They developed tactics and jungle warfare expertise that American units learned from and adopted. But that reality doesn't fit the Hollywood version, where Americans save the world while everyone else watches. So it gets edited out or footnoted or mentioned briefly, before moving on to battles with more American involvement. Milne Bay challenges that narrative because it's a battle won primarily by Australian forces before significant American ground troops arrived in theatre, which means acknowledging its importance requires acknowledging Australia's crucial role in the Pacific War, and that's a complexity many popular histories would rather avoid. The tactical innovations that emerge from Milne Bay influence the entire Pacific campaign, because the Australians figure out how to fight effectively in jungle terrain against an enemy that supposedly owns that environment. They develop small unit tactics focused on ambush and infiltration. They learn to use the terrain for defense while remaining mobile enough for counterattacks. They prove that properly positioned machine guns and anti-tank weapons can stop Japanese armor in confined spaces. And all of these lessons get passed to American forces fighting at Guadalcanal and later campaigns. Military knowledge transfer is one of those boring aspects of warfare that doesn't make for exciting stories, but determines who wins and who loses. If you can learn from your victories and your defeats faster than the enemy, if you can adapt your tactics and training based on real combat experience, if you can institutionalize best practices across your forces, then you have an enormous advantage over enemies who fight the same way regardless of results. Japan's military culture after Milne Bay struggles with this adaptation because acknowledging defeat means admitting mistakes, means questioning decisions made by superior officers, and their hierarchical culture makes that kind of honest assessment nearly impossible. So they keep repeating the same tactical approaches that failed at Milne Bay and keep losing battles they should win. August 2024. And there are maybe a handful of Milne Bay veterans still alive. Men in their late 90s and beyond who remember fighting in the rain and mud, who remember the sound of Japanese tanks on that coastal track, who remember the relief when the evacuation began, and the knowledge that they'd held when holding seemed impossible. And I wonder if they feel vindicated now that some historians are calling Milne Bay the real turning point of the Pacific Ground War. Or if they're frustrated that it took 80 years for people to recognize what they accomplished. Or if they mostly just remember the friends who didn't come home and wish the whole thing had never happened. Veterans are complicated like that. They want recognition for their service, but they don't want war glorified. They want people to understand what they endured, but they can't fully explain it to anyone who wasn't there. They're proud of winning, but haunted by the cost. And when historians call their battle a turning point, they probably think, we were just trying to survive and do our jobs and not let our mates down. Because that's what combat really is. Not grand strategy and turning points and historical significance, but ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances doing what they have to do. So here's the truth about the day Japan lost the Pacific War. It wasn't one day, it was 2 weeks. It wasn't at Midway, it was at a place most people can't find on a map. And it wasn't a dramatic carrier battle, it was muddy grinding infantry combat that proved Japanese troops could be beaten on land by properly trained and motivated enemies. Milne Bay matters because it destroyed Japanese assumptions, because it shifted strategic momentum, because it gave Allied forces confidence they could win ground battles in the Pacific, and because it happened exactly when it needed to happen to prevent Japanese consolidation of their defensive perimeter. You want to understand why Japan lost the war? Start at Milne Bay not because it was the biggest battle, or the bloodiest or the most famous, but because it was the first time the Japanese army faced defeat and couldn't pretend it was just bad luck or temporary setback. It was the moment their strategy for the Pacific collapsed. and they never recovered. That Australian naval officer standing on the beach, watching Japanese ships retreat in September 1942, understood what had happened, even if the rest of the world didn't notice. He'd just witnessed history turning on a swampy beach in the middle of nowhere, and everything that followed, Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, all of it built on the foundation of that first ground victory at Milne Bay. If this kind of detailed historical analysis, based on primary sources and tactical realities, rather than popular mythology, interests you, hit subscribe, because we're going deep into battles and campaigns that changed history but don't get the attention they deserve. And drop a comment telling me which overlooked World War II battle you think needs this treatment, because there are dozens of stories like Milne Bay waiting to be told, fought by soldiers who deserve recognition, deciding outcomes that shape the world we live in today, and I'm going to keep telling them until everyone understands that history is more complex and more interesting than the simplified narratives we learned in school.